We are here, big day. We scheduled it with big news. There's even potentially bigger news, so much news. I invited the man whose politics is always on display in the blog, but confounds everyone. No one gets his politics right. So what better person to unravel the mysteries before us? Welcome, Gary Leff of View from the Wing.
Thank you, Stefan. Good to talk to you. It's a very good and optimistic day.
And give the very quick recap. What's optimistic today in your view? I've ignored everybody talking about vaccines the past months and all the self-appointed experts, but you have quite a sense of what's newsworthy and what's noise.
Right. I mean, so I've been sort of a vaccine optimist, as it were, throughout. Although it's always never been, certain that we would get there. But all along the way, things look to be going pretty well. We don't have data yet. We don't have real data. We just have the press release, the news out of Pfizer that as their stage 3 trial has progressed, they are finding 90% efficacy in their vaccine, and that the side effects have not been really serious either, right? So it's something that people tolerate and that seems to really work. And they are potentially even within a couple weeks of seeking an FDA emergency use authorization for the vaccine as well, and they could have 50 million doses by the end of the year. Now, 50 million doses. This is a 2-dose regimen, right? So that means actually 25 million people. Mostly likely to go in the U.S., but that's worldwide. I mean, it's their total capacity. So it's not something where we're all going to go out and get it in a matter of weeks. But the science appears so far to be really good. The way they structure these trials is they set a predefined number of events where a certain number of people in the trial, combined between the vaccine group and the placebo, will have gotten the virus. And they'll take a look and see what the split is between the vaccine group and the placebo group. And where they're at now, it looks like you're something like 9 times or better more likely to get the virus if you haven't taken the vaccine than if you have, which is really good. Now, those numbers may not hold when we get beyond the numbers that we're looking at in the trial. It could be that the people who are volunteering, maybe, some of them may have gotten antibody tests, and they know they had it, and others knew they didn't. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why it may not be perfect. We may not be able to say with certainty this is a 90% effective vaccine, but it is shown the level of efficacy that we'd say, okay, we don't need to wait a really long time to know if this thing works. It seems to really make a difference. And so when they reach the point in less than a couple weeks where the half the people in the trial have had the second dose for at least 2 months, that's the point at which the FDA has said they would consider an emergency use authorization, which would also be a huge milestone. But really, it's just the exciting thing today is the science that says, hey, it looks like the Pfizer vaccine really works. And in fairness, it may not even be the first and probably won't be the last, but it gives us a lot of hope that we have a real chance of returning to normal by mid next year.
Fantastic. And I've also lost track of how many different efforts the various countries. Tyler Cowen, who you know well, has written about, should we have more access to the Chinese vaccines? The U.S. has supported different projects. What is the state of all the different national efforts? And I understand the Pfizer is not part of the much heralded U.S. driven projects.
I mean, they say they're not, but they sort of are. In July, the federal government entered a purchase agreement to buy $2 billion for 100 million doses, right? So they were getting a huge upfront agreement that was going to guarantee them pretty much their research and development money on this. So they didn't do it in conjunction with the federal government.
Mhm.
But it's also not surprising. Look, governments all over the world are rushing to buy
Mhm.
vaccines and try to secure for their citizens, early slots to get them, because initially the problem is going to be there's not going to be enough doses to go around. I mean, Pfizer says that next year in total they think they can put out 1.2 billion doses, again, for 600 million people, right? So that's less than 10% of the world. And so that's not enough for next year. But they are one of a number of different vaccine candidates. We should have good information soon on the Moderna vaccine.
Mhm.
We should have good information soon on the Oxford AstraZeneca out of the UK. And we're entering a stage 3 trial for Novavax, which could be very effective as well. Anyway, so there are also, as you observe, vaccines from elsewhere in the world. China, frankly, since early summer, has been vaccinating members of its military, sort of a conscripted, maybe sort of a human challenge trial, as it were, right? There now are emergency use authorizations for one of the Sinopharm vaccines in both the UAE and Bahrain. And so it does actually appear that probably a couple of the Chinese candidates probably are both safe and effective. It's long been thought that they would be less effective than the technologies used by others. They're either using attenuated virus, like dead virus, basically, to get the body to react, or in some cases, there's using other viruses to bring the message to create antibodies to COVID-19. But in some cases, that leads to the problem of people who are already have immunity from prior exposure to the vaccine, for instance, to that virus, for instance. So there's lots of different techniques to all of this, but the point is that there's a lot of folks working really hard. My own belief, and I'm really excited by the efficacy that Pfizer claims today, because I had kind of expected this first generation vaccine to be like effective enough that it helps us, but I hadn't assumed that we would get such big numbers, because if like 50% of people take a 90% effective vaccine, we basically get what we need. If most people took it, we'd vanquish the thing, if those numbers sort of hold out.
At times I've asked you in the points context, what you read, and your answer is usually, I read everything.
Oh.
And many of us have encountered new fields, such as we just discussed, where we're trying to make sense, if only for our personal decisions. How have you approached your information intake and learning these past months since March, as you're branching out, you're encountering new things, making critical decisions for your own work and family?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I will say that Twitter is amazing, but it really depends on following the right people on Twitter. So, early in this, I wanted to know who the really smart people were, and I started following, infectious disease journalists, science journalists, biomedical journalists, and some of the scientists themselves. But look, I'm a lay person, and I'm looking for somebody who has a lot of experience in covering this and can really break down some of what's going on. And although they'll also point to preprint research that I'll read. None of this is the final word on anything. We have discovered so much so quickly. It's amazing. It's all been a work in progress. And some of the things that we thought early on, turn out not to be quite right. But but you're making decisions based on our probabilities. And my own view is I like to read smart people. Whether I would necessarily start off, assuming I'm going to agree with them or not, or people who talk in worlds that I already know. Like, well, if I already, I want to make sure that I'm seeing what people are talking about, or if they discover something that I don't know yet, I want to make sure that I know it. But I really enjoy reading smart people in areas of interest, outside of what I already know, because then I can learn.
Fantastic. And what will be the trigger where I would say you're a person, as I understand, that very much wants to travel, but does not necessarily have essential travel, certainly not on the leisure side, young family at home. What would be the trigger? I'm going to take whatever vaccine and I'm going to go back out and get and cringe at bare feet in the Maldives.
Yes. So there's a few things that go into all of this for me. Much of my travel in the before times was business travel, and I haven't had any of that, right? And like if a 90% effective vaccine could get us to a place where we have actual big conferences and events again sooner than we otherwise might have expected, which is cool. But even just visiting people in their offices hasn't been a thing. Small gatherings haven't been a thing for business travel. For my leisure travel, I mean, there's several things. Obviously, the restrictions on where you can go have been a big deal. The challenge is if things don't go right in terms of fewer flights and misconnects are a bigger deal. You may not be able to enter where you're even connecting, right? Not what I want to do with a young child. And so that's been a constraint. And also, I send her to a school which has great precautions, but they've required anytime you leave town that you keep them home for 5 days and then to bring a negative test before they're allowed back in, or 14-day quarantine. And so that's a huge constraint. So I have what I've done kind of two things along the way. I have localish travel that's within the bounds of what they allow that doesn't require the quarantine. So I live in Texas and I can do some things relatively locally that involve travel, not just being at home. So that's good. And also I've been booking a ton of stuff into the future. And the great thing about booking, well, I don't want to just be buying paid tickets and there's no change fees. Yeah, but airlines are holding my cash.
Yeah.
I'm not super keen on that. But mileage tickets are great because I redeposit those, and there's not a whole lot on the hook. And so I've been booking lots of awards, and some of them will happen and some of them won't. I'm hopeful that some of them will happen, but I've needed to have this sort of what are the demarcation points? What are the things? What are the things to look forward to? And so when I write about award availability, I may be booking something, too. I'm not saying here's the trip I'm taking because I have no idea. This is the whole challenge now is uncertainty, and we'll get to a point at which we're less uncertain. But for now, I mean, if you were just going to go to Hawaii and you were saying, okay, well, they're talking about opening August 1, so let me book. I don't want to book the first week because that's, who knows what's going to happen. So I'll book, August 15th. Okay, well, then the reopening is, that's September didn't work. And well, now they've reopened with the negative test. I read about a family over the weekend that got their negative test and brought it with them and was told to quarantine anyway because the folks who looked at it didn't accept it. By the time they made it home, they got an email, oh gosh, in Hawaii, we screwed up. You're released from quarantine. Well, gosh, we're already home in San Diego. So there's the regime uncertainty, the changing. A friend of mine lives in New York. Before they switched over to everyone tests, they had their required quarantines for people returning from specific states. Well, took a weekend in Arizona because Arizona wasn't on the list of states, and so he could just come home. Well, while he was going for the long weekend, Arizona was added to the list, right? And so he's like, okay, I'm in Arizona. He shows up and he's supposed to quarantine. So the changing of rules has been the biggest challenge, I think, there has to be what to do where you're going. If it's business travel, you have to be able to meet with people or have events. Places have to be open for leisure. Whatever it is that you're going for, that has to be there. But changing rules as much as anything is a big problem. And I think then the uncertainty of, well, if you are exposed to someone and you have to quarantine where you are, and can you even come home the way that you plan? And so that's so we'll get to the place where a lot of those uncertainties are sorted out. plus just what is the course of the virus? I mean, you may be traveling from into a place where it's not currently a hotspot, and then by the time your travel comes around, that's completely changed. And so, a lot of last minute travel, last minute planning has just been over, the norm. But if today's news means anything, it's hopeful that we have a path back to the new normal, to something like what normal was in 2021, which a lot of us have been, betting on and guessing and pretty confident of, like me. But I think that this is a reason to believe that prior is true.
What's a framework for evaluating, well, we'll say an international destination? I mean, even a country level is very broad, but I'm thinking of posts a few weeks back. You wrote about Steve Belkin going around Tanzania and investing. I mean, just peering into hospital wards. I mean, and it seemed the overall takeaway was they seem to be doing really well, even though they don't seem to be taking any precautions. And then in contrast, when you wrote about Costa Rica, who the tenor of comments was they've been doing really well, so now they're unleashing every American from every state on the country with no testing. And that was my trigger of, if I was thinking of a trip, I might redeposit. So I'm not even in the framework of actively making those decisions, so I haven't made a framework for myself.
Yeah, I mean, part of the challenge is there's still so much that we don't understand. Because if you look at Africa, outside of South Africa, most countries have really done pretty well. And we don't know for sure why. Maybe it's because of, outside life, the vitamin D levels. Maybe it's because of all of the viruses that people are sort of exposed to on a regular basis already. And so, that there's, cross immunities. Part of it may be, younger average population ages. There's a number of things, that could be going on there. We don't know for sure what it is, but Africa has done really well, and so has much of Asia, right? If you look at Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos. It's not just because these governments are so robust and good at managing public health, right? There's got to be something else going on. But what's weird is that it didn't seem to, whatever's kept things at bay. I mean, the New York Times reported that 90% of cases in Thailand were asymptomatic, right? Like what's going on there? And why wasn't that the case in China though? So, if it was an earlier virus circulating that folks gained immunity to, why was that not the case? So, why has Japan done so well? Even when they have spikes, they weren't really significant. They haven't done a lot of testing, right? There's, pretty universal mask wearing, but that hasn't helped everywhere. They've, avoided large group indoor congregate settings. But what is the mystery that explains their seeming success? And we don't know. But if I'm thinking about where do I want to travel, so first, have I had the vaccine? The vaccine isn't just about protecting yourself. It's like when everyone has it, then there's a lot less spreading. Once you reach a certain threshold. So I think you kind of do want to travel to places that are likely to have had the vaccine, access. Versus places that haven't, where unless those places are not have not had significant caseloads. Also, trips that allow for more distancing, at least initially, seem to be a little bit more desirable, because we're not rid of this, and we're not going to be for a while. Because if we're talking about 7 billion people in the world, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are 2 doses. Right? I mean, so that's, that would be 14 billion doses. We're not anywhere close. And you don't have to have everyone with it. And that there's a lot of people in the US for sure that aren't going to take it because of one thing or another. And I think that there'll be early adopters and late adopters, right? But yeah, I think, have the places had access to it so that there's likely less spread where you're going. And can you avoid, big, sort of indoor congregate settings with lots of people?
Have any of your arguments you found actually persuaded people the past months about, uh, let's say, the mask issue, which you posted again today, a very neutral piece about business travel returning, and the comments section is people taking it in their various directions that are very emotional and very very expected. So what arguments have you found that convince anyone of anything the past 7-8 months?
Oh, yeah, so I think that so most people who comment on blog posts, like they're not the majority of people that read the posts. If in a given blog post, say 10,000 people or 20,000 people have read it, and there are 40 comments, those aren't necessarily representative of the people that have read it. And of those 40 comments, they're like by 3 people in total. Whether it's the same 3 people's like name in the comments or not, or it's like the 3 people who are registering as like 7 different people each, I mean, so and the people who are given a comment, feel passionately, maybe they have their own agenda. I think what's been most useful is just, what have I read in more specialized places that folks may not have thought about. And I'm not necessarily looking to convince people as much as offer a perspective that they might not have seen without having read what I wrote. And if I can do that, maybe they think about it. Maybe it challenges what they think. Maybe it fills in some gaps for them, or maybe they think I'm just wrong. And that's okay too, if it helps them get to a place that's better informed than they were. And I should say, look, I don't always agree with myself 100% of the time, so I don't expect that like readers do either. I want to, I'm working through ideas.
Let's pivot a bit to government and certainly the past 4 years, the U.S. administration has been very noisy in very many respects. I would say the Secretary of Transportation is very much a longtime Washington operator that flies very under the radar. Is almost invisible in media mentions, and I'm not aware of really what the Department of Transportation has been doing the past 4 years. And I'm just curious to catch us up on where things are now before we talk about where things may shift.
Well, so I mean, there's lots of different things in the bailiwick of DOT, and it's the parent of FAA, where they've been pretty busy with the 737 Max, for instance. I think that we haven't seen an activist Department of Transportation under Elaine Chao's leadership. That isn't super surprising for folks that don't know. I mean, she's a longtime Republican leader. Her husband is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. She has a long history in government as well as in business. She was a Northwest Airlines board member once upon a time, even. And it's been a fairly pro airline stance, but they haven't really dismantled a whole lot that the Obama administration had done either. Actually, interestingly, there were a number of initiatives that were held towards the end of the Obama administration that they just didn't pull the trigger on, even as they were even as their time in government was ending. I mean, late in the Obama administration, they were looking at regulating how airfare could be displayed on travel agency websites, on airline websites. It had to immediately sort of show you what all the relevant fees were at the time that you were searching airfare. Their initial suggestion in their original notice of proposed rulemaking was that all the fees be a pop-up when you hover over a price, which would not work super well in mobile. But this was the idea. They also wanted anyone that did, any place that didn't show all airlines to flag airlines that weren't being shown, which was sort of like the free advertising for Southwest Airlines Act. There were a bunch of things, and that every price had to break out taxes in a certain. There were all kinds of things that they were looking at doing that they didn't actually do at the end of that administration. Some of those ideas may be things that a Biden administration could pick up on. but there was a drive towards price transparency and fee transparency in the Obama administration, but they just didn't. They didn't get to a place where they knew what to do.
And so it sounds like it's been more or less continuity the past 4 years. Where does the MAX stand? It's one that I guess I tuned into while I was traveling, and now that I've been tuning out a bit on it.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't have an exact date for when we should likely see final approval, but it should come fairly soon. There may be modifications to what the FAA had put forward. There have been some requests from pilots, especially American Airlines pilots, Southwest pilots, that seek to have the specific training requirements and the documentation revised to make it clearer, and that they seem to think sort of convoluted. But we are going to see an approved return of the 737 MAX. In fact, Europe's Aviation Safety Administration has said that they're ready to approve it. They've said that publicly before the U.S. has. The U.S. will approve it. They will then follow suit, but the U.S. will approve it. What will then happen is there will be time for the airlines to take the required training programs. They will have their trainers properly trained, and then they'll begin to put pilots through training that will involve running them through flight simulators, which means that there's a limit to how fast they can do. I mean, and American Airlines, I think, has access to 3 MAX simulators, one that they own, one of Boeing's, and one from an MRO that they've contracted for. So but they're going to be running these constantly, which is why once it's approved, you're going to see the brought back in the schedule in different timelines. American currently has a few MAX flights at the very end of December in their schedule. They may not make that; it may get pushed, but they're trying to aggressively add it back on the idea that a mid-November approval could put it on the schedule like 6 weeks later. Southwest has said that they're going to be like 4 or 5 months from approval to when they're actually flying the plane again, on the theory that, look, we have planes parked, we don't need to, we're not in a hurry. Although Americans' view is, look, we're going to replace some of the older 737-800s in our schedule that are less efficient planes, more costly to operate, with MAXs just as soon as we can. So different airlines will take different timelines, but somewhere between 6 weeks to 5 months from when the approval to when it returns to the air.
And I happened to look at the business news and big stock movers, and of course, many travel stocks popped before they opened today, and I saw the name Rolls-Royce pop up as one of the biggest. And all I know is the continuing travails captured on the Dots Lines Destinations podcast about their engines. Where is the thing with the engines, and is there a hope with this? It just seems a multi-year.
So I don't think that I'm sufficiently expert on the engines to really say where those are going to go. I'm certainly aware of all the problems, but this isn't the mechanics of them, and the capabilities of Rolls-Royce or just engine manufacturers generally is outside of most of what I follow.
All right, and as we said, the U.S. Department of Transportation, you said it wasn't a huge shift over the past 4 years. What are you expecting that will impact travelers in the coming administration?
Yeah, I mean, so it's going to be difficult to say exactly what we're going to see out of a Biden administration. I mean, we have some sense maybe of what their priorities could be, but if we have a Republican-controlled Senate, there may be some constraints there on how much spending they can do. We're also going to be facing, really big deficit. Like even though there hasn't been a third round of stimulus, we've spent an incredible amount of money this year, as certainly makes sense given the magnitude of the crisis. But there may just be less in the kitty, and and Congress may not be willing to go along with. It's not going to be possible for the president to put forward all of the things that he had proposed as spending plans during the campaign. So where things like infrastructure, airport investment falls, just really not yet clear. But we do know that infrastructure investment is a stated priority of the president-elect. And so we probably will see more going on there than we've had. Is there going to be more vigorous antitrust enforcement? Well, could that constrain future mergers between airlines? Certainly. Although if anyone were in a position to do it when they were especially weakened by the virus, that could be a get out of antitrust jail free card. The Pfizer news maybe makes it less likely that we get there. And seeing all the stock moves from the airlines, last I looked, American Airlines was up about 16%, United almost 20% today, towards the end of the day, on the theory that, look, they have a much quicker path to getting back to normal and much more likely chance of ultimate survival, right? And on the flip side, if we're all back in the sky, Zoom was down a parallel amount today, because we may not all be using Zoom for everything. I use it to visit with my family in Australia, not just for work meetings all day long, right?
The air traffic control seems to be one that I have heard as long as I've been traveling. I mean, it's a political hobby horse in some things. I guess going back to the Reagan era references to it, but the idea of the need for modernization of the U.S. system and what that modernization should look like. What's your take?
Yeah, so the U.S. is somewhat anomalous in where the government doesn't just regulate air traffic control; it actually is the provider of air traffic control services, and it has not done a very good job of investing in technology. And in normal times, many parts of the national skies are incredibly crowded and are very limiting of growth of air travel, and cause air travel to take more time. And so there is certainly a reasonable idea that we can do better, and that other places in the world do better. I mean, one of the easiest analogs is Nav Canada. You think, oh, well, Canada's like so much smaller, except that they actually control the North Atlantic. So when you're flying transatlantic, your plane is likely being handed off to Nav Canada, and they've done a better job investing in technology. They're not using paper flight strips like there's use of in some with the U.S. They and part of it just is a function of how do you get your budget. If you're dealing with Congress every year, it's really it's difficult to invest in long-term capital projects. But if you have a separately incorporated nonprofit entity, as NAB Canada is, you can have you can issue bonds, and you can have set user fees appropriately. They've actually been lower cost than the U.S. has, and most of the time largely driven down costs. So during the Trump administration, there was a move to a NAV Canada model where you would have a separately incorporated nonprofit with stakeholder boards, with some representation from commercial airlines, some representation of general aviation, et cetera. And they sort of got close, but they didn't get there. I would not expect, and by the way, this is something that the Air Traffic Controllers Union is generally supported. So this is not a labor kind of issue, but in general, I would assume this is largely off the table in a Biden presidency.
Yeah, that just made me think. I mean, it seems a whole different world when there were so many, say, the housekeeping staff protesting outside many particular Marriott properties. Was that a year ago, 2 years ago? Where does the labor movement stand as regards to the travel and hospitality industry?
Well, I mean, you have to think that they're going to have a lot more friends at the Department of Labor. They're certainly have, in general, a friend in the White House. How much of a difference it's going to make in any industry isn't necessarily clear. There are some things that can be done, by executive order with respect to perhaps federal workers, but for airlines, I think that the largest driver of conditions for employees in the industry is going to be the health of the industry.
Hmm.
And there's not a whole lot that ultimately who's in charge in Washington is going to change there. It's not going to change the contracts that they get. Yeah.
Excellent. Then let's go rapid fire through some of the industries. What are the companies you're watching for indications of how things are, or interesting stories to follow? Airline is the one many of us points travelers focus on the most. Which domestic airlines are you following with most interest, and why?
Oh, well, look, I mean, I've got a mental model of sort of each of them, and I'm most interested when they, either confirm or act against that model. So, American has been really interesting to me for a while because their merger with U.S. Airways was last. There was just the most going on there.
Mm-hmm.
They've also, been financially a laggard, and they have the most debt, and so, they've also been the largest airline. And so I've always had. Plus, I've flown them for the better part of the last decade, the most. United with Scott Kirby in charge, and I kind of have a mental model there that you don't expect a whole lot that's customer friendly. From that, on the other hand, they. One of the things I really like is that they are running the APU during boarding and deplaning, right? So they're recirculating cabin air, and so you get the benefit of of the outside air refresh and the filtration of the plane in a way that that you don't have on others.
Mm-hmm.
Delta generally has been, I think, the best airline to fly, although they're a laggard returning any kind of a semblance of service to their in-flight product.
Mm-hmm.
The mileage program is a dumpster fire. I mean, gosh, to see devaluations of loyalty programs at Delta and United during a global pandemic, and it's not like their costs associated with these redemptions have been going up during this time. People are redeeming a lot fewer miles, but we've seen the partner awards that have gone up in price, where airlines actually have to give money to a different airline for the travel that they're booking, and they've not sort of wanted to do that. It's the same thing about why United was so reluctant to give refunds. I sort of watch them all, but mostly domestically initially, because it's where until restrictions are lifted internationally. Then my biggest interest is just going to be who's adding back service, because
Mm-hmm.
frankly, it's going to be a function of like where can I go,
Mm-hmm.
and where can I go with some degree of convenience where there's not a huge risk if irregular operation strands me somewhere, right? Where I can get another flight. That's going to matter quite a lot. So I'm now also just starting to look at what are the hotels in, where do I want to go, and what are the places I want to stay, because some people talk about this as uh, as pent up demand. I mean, think of it
Mm-hmm.
as intertemporal substitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've been staying at home a lot, and now you're gonna like stay at home less and travel a lot. You kind of move the travel that was supposed to be over like the last year into the
Mm-hmm.
future. Well, I'm now want to like do a lot of that. So where do I want to go? And where do I want to stay when I go? But also, gosh, I had a post some months ago where I suggested, if you're a vaccine researcher, right, and you think things are going really well, you ought to be buying cruise stocks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can't trade on maybe the inside information of your company, okay, but you could probably make a bet on some of these other industries. So just sort of seeing how all of this recovers, and I'm just looking to what can I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my to-dos last Friday that I didn't get to was take a punt on some of the cruise stocks, and I didn't get to it. I'm not good dealing with my Pacific time zone, and today I woke up early and it was already pre-market up 30% across the board. So I was a little too slow on making that confident bet. Yeah. Mentioning the cruise, I mean, it's an industry I don't really follow. It just strikes me as that the cruise industry fans of travelers are so dedicated to it, it has to come back in some form and come back in a large way. And that's the extent of my insight.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it will, but the industry will be different. It will be smaller,
Mhm.
and it'll come back somewhat slowly because it's not just the diehards alone don't sustain the industry.
Mhm.
There will be customers who want to cruise. There are customers who would cruise now,
Mhm.
right? Like, which to
Mhm.
me is just like this is like crazy.
Mhm.
You're now that I will say, like if you're in your cabin, that's probably fine.
Mhm.
We not been able to find instances that have been documented about spread between separated rooms.
Mhm.
We see spread in large rooms, right? Open plan.
Mhm.
But if you're just like in your room, or you're in your room at the hotel, there now with the original SARS, we did
Mhm.
see some through spread through plumbing
Mhm.
in a residential complex. But as a general matter, it's not been spread through the air through walls,
Mhm.
right? Or for that, even through HVAC systems. So the cruise doesn't. It's being in the same room with a lot of people, the dining rooms. Yeah, I wouldn't do that now.
And the comeback of hotel in-room desks. So much of the design moves of the past few years were absolutely the opposite of what pandemic concerned travelers are looking for. It's even suites that are not really suites because they're actually studios and you can't work in a separate space. It
Oh, well, look, the model was they give you these teeny rooms and they want you to spend all your time in their shared space.
Mhm.
And oh, by the way, spending money on their food and beverage, right? And it's congregating in these large shared spaces, ordering food and beverages that they're not serving now. Like it's, but hey, Marriott made $100 million last quarter. So the property owners may be suffering, but Marriott, after all, cutting all the staff they cut,
Mm.
seemed to do okay.
And how do I've been just so puzzled by the hotel price setting, and that uh, it makes sense to me that the brands that are perceived as pandemic friendly arrangements, like a Residence Inn, those prices have held very high. That even uh, say the typical court. I'm mostly following in Seattle, and it's like these courtyards that we've been going to for staycations for several months. The weekday rates are always high, as if business travelers are turning up. And when we've stayed there on a and on a Monday night, there's not one night lit up, and yet on weekends they're full and the rates are low. And just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a guessing game, but it feels like a lot of the hotels are still going by the playbook of a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, there is some of that. It depends on whether they're, part of a larger ownership group and that they're doing their own revenue management or they're deferring to the chain,
Mm.
and whether they've actually made adjustments, and some of them haven't. As a general matter, I mean, we have seen prices come down somewhat, but not as much as I would expect, because it does seem like a lot of hotels are opting to hold price and sacrifice occupancy, rather than fighting for every guest in the market with low prices. And so, yeah, we're seeing a lot of high advertised prices.
Actually, that particular courtyard is one that, ironically, is offering free breakfast to all guests, which courtyards spend so much time for decades fighting breakfast. But also, it's one of those that has been threatened to move to Sonesta. All those IHG ones moved. Tell us about how that deal works, and this idea of these large ownership groups deflagging en masse from one to the other.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to understand about the large hotel chains is that for the most part, they don't own the hotels. They, some own more than others. Hyatt has a handful of assets that they'll buy a hotel in an area to get into the area, then they may sell it and they'll use the money and buy a hotel somewhere else. But Marriott owns practically nothing. They are a brand.
Mhm.
They're a marketing channel,
Mhm.
and they also operate hotels. If you own a hotel that is a Marriott employees may be working in that hotel, or it may be your employees working in the hotel. You may be running it yourself, and you're just franchising it. And
Mhm.
so Marriott is managing your marketing, but not actually running the property. And so there's the ownership group owns it, there's the ownership group operates it, and they just license out the name basically with certain brand standards that go along with it. And so you have and when a hotel chain is trying to please its customers, the customer isn't always the guest. The customer may be the ownership group of the property. And that's also one of the things with hotel loyalty programs. Is they've got to satisfy not just the guest, but the owners of the hotel who have to deliver on the promised benefits. And when you redeem points for a room, Marriott, for instance, then has to pay the hotel for the room that you've redeemed for. And when the property is full, it costs them a lot more than when the property is not full. And that's why, in general, there's been this move to variable pricing of redemptions or high and low seasons, right? Because when there are certain dates they're really, really confident aren't going to be sold out, and it's not going to cost more money to the chain to pay for the room, and so they can charge that low season rate. Whereas there are some dates that they're really confident it's a good chance that it could sell out. It could be really expensive. They charge more points, and so instead of just having the average where they're kind of overcharging on some nights and undercharging on others, they go to more of a tailor it to how much it's actually likely to cost them. Although then Marriott seems to just charge high season pricing all the time, which has been crazy during the pandemic when hotels have been empty and you see months at a time hotels high season, like what's going on. And then some of that is just not training the systems right, and then some of it is because they can. But I went off on a tangent, and you actually asked me a specific question where I just thought like differentiating between the models made some sense at the start, but I don't even remember what I was answering.
I was just worried about a hotel like going to Sonesta, but I think we got to the concept.
Yeah, and so the ownership group, in the case of the ownership group of the IHG properties, they're guaranteed a certain amount of revenue. Deals can vary. It can be, there may or may not be a guarantee involved. I know there was a hotel in New York where one of the big chains was actually losing, over $10 million a year because to get that hotel as part of their brand, they guaranteed a certain amount of money. And then they weren't delivering on it, so they had to write a check at the end of every year. And so they worked really hard to solve that, and they eventually did. But in the case, so this company that owned a bunch of properties with IHG had some guarantees. IHG wasn't making the guarantee payments. They had a dispute. Presumably IHG is saying, look, well, there's this sort of force majeure event, or and we're not obligated, but a dispute over that. And so the ownership group says, okay, well, if you're not paying us what we're owed, we're going to take our hotels and call them something else. We're going to go over here to Sonesta, which, oh, by the way, we own a big chunk of too.
Excellent. And of the just because they can, you mentioned partner awards, and CJ's asking about Alaska Airlines, devaluation, One World, all of that. I know you've been asked again and again and again. What's your outlook for Alaska in 2021?
So before the pandemic, I had written that I expected that they would devalue their program because of their partnership with American Airlines. And American had a concern, going into the original severing of the partnership about mileage plan being more generous than Advantage, and it made sense for people to credit to mileage plan even if they're flying American, even American's own customers. This was a challenge, and I said, gosh, if they're getting back together and eventually even joining One World, then they must have worked through these challenges. And what we had seen was, if I were even a first tier elite or a non-elite customer, it would make all the sense in the world to me if I'm flying American to credit to mileage plan. Say that I even had some earned status with Alaska, and I would fly American, and I could have used my Alaska status to get access to extra legroom coach seats. Right, earning the status on Alaska is easier. The miles are more valuable. Now, American has made a change where then they said, okay, well, One World elites don't have access to these extra legroom seats now. And then they said, okay, but wait a minute, we actually Didn't mean that, because we have these joint venture partners in British Airways and Iberia and Finnair, and we want to give it to them, and Japan Airlines, we want to give it to them. But oddly, they didn't give it to joint venture partner Qantas. But so maybe they won't. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't with Alaska. But anyway, the point being is that given the increasingly close relationship, the intended code share, the joining of One World, it becomes really hard for for everyone else to look at Alaska and say you're going to steal all our customers. I just assume they worked something out. Now, then the pandemic came, and that changes a lot. Does it make less sense to devalue in a pandemic world where airlines are hurting so much? Well, I don't know. I mean, United and Delta have devalued, but just their partner awards. It may change the calculation.
I mean, it always seemed like when I would ask if you have more industry context than I do, but when I would see people at a Freddie Awards or even ask, say you about, partner awards don't matter much. Not many people redeem for them. The travelers redeem for them like them, but it's not a big deal. So they sort of linger. But now it's just like gratuitous pain from Delta and United with, as you said, when very few people are redeeming for these.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost been this fear among U.S. programs generally that someone somewhere might actually benefit from the loyalty program. Right? And then that's why I think there's a lot more value in some of the international programs and flying on the partners and and having not the airline co-brand here, but the but the bank transferable points that you can transfer to. Well, if Emirates is going to say we're not going to let our partner airlines other than Qantas redeem for first class awards anymore, starting in April of next year. Well, everybody's points transfer to Emirates, and by the way, Emirates stopped adding fuel surcharges onto their awards. So, let's just play with Emirates Skywards, but only when we want to redeem for a first class award, right? And if it's a really short haul flight, redeem through Qantas. But there has been this, even like when American Airlines this summer was running bonus points for buying tickets. Great, you're going to use the loyalty program to encourage incremental travel on your airline. They said, gosh, okay, but we're going to cap the earning. And by the way, you're earning based on how much money you spend with us. We're going to cap the earning. You're not going to earn more than 10,000 miles in this promotion. Like if somebody were going to, I'm going to give you $100,000, like you're no, like don't, you could only earn miles when you're spending money with the airline, and you're going to say, but we got to make sure that nobody gets more than 10,000 miles from this. Like why? Other than
expensive tickets, they can only earn 70,000 miles at that point.
And then if you care about the miles, and then you book 2 one-ways and or break the trip up somewhere else. But no, it's like, is it revenue based or not?
Will the next generation of business travelers, if they exist at all, care about the mileage at all, or is it going benefits for them, and the mileage people are the credit card holders? To what degree they're exclusive?
Yeah, I mean, so it matters. Look, fundamentally, loyalty marketing involves both recognition and reward, and those principles aren't going to change. And maybe someone will finally be creative in the U.S. and actually reward flights again. But I think it matters. Reward matters. It's just that the points from credit cards have dwarfed the points earning from flights for some time. Now, back to the question of what could happen in a Biden administration. I'm not predicting this because of the split control of Congress, because Joe Biden himself was senator from Delaware. His history of being quite supportive of banks, and because the airlines have taken out such big mortgages against their loyalty programs, and without co-brand credit card deals, I couldn't pay these back. And then there'd be a real problem. I mean, in the case of American Airlines, they pledged the Advantage program to the Department of Treasury in exchange for a subsidized CARES Act loan. If American couldn't pay this loan back, which they plan to do with the money from their credit card deals, the U.S. federal government would own Advantage. I mean, this is like what I can imagine. This is the world that Biden would push us into. But a Democratic priority at one point had been capping, limiting of credit card interchange fees, which would be a stake in the heart of the co-brand credit card business. I mean, that would certainly make rewards for flying matter again, at least in a relative sense.
Will Air Canada be rewarded for putting some thought into a program that I think it certainly intent is trying to be something that customers will value and welcome, even if there's always people on the margins that are upset about this and that.
Look, I think it's an interesting and thoughtful program. There are things that I like about it and things that I don't like about it, but I think that they're doing some creative things they're going to be able to take care of their customers, their best customers, a lot better than they used to when the program was separately owned by AMIA. Just because the incentives are now much more closely aligned. It used to be the case that if you were a top tier super elite and you redeem miles and you wanted to make a change or redeposit, Air Canada could not get the fees waived for a top tier elite because AMIA was like, well, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. You just pay us instead, right? You pay us, $150 for every change your member makes. Okay, every other airline in the world was waiving the fee, but they couldn't. It was one of the first things they did when they bought it back. So this was they're able to do a lot more in conjunction with their top members, and they're making the points more useful to occasional members, both in terms of family pooling and also the ability to even earn status from just other activities besides flying. The lowest level of status becomes possible, and they can offer them the flight benefits. And so there's a lot of things that I think that they're doing nicely. And relative, so then the question is, are they rewarded? Well, relative to who? They're certainly rewarded by their credit card partners because they paid for the reacquisition of their loyalty program and saved them from having to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build up a member base. Will they be rewarded by Canadian customers? Well, okay, compared to WestJet, now some Canadian customers are just going to be mad that they haven't gotten their refunds for canceled tickets, and that's not the loyalty program's fault, but the loyalty program can't fix that. But compared to WestJet, it's a much better program. So, I think yes. And one interesting question is how they're rewarded by U.S. consumers, which matter more than you might expect, because in normal times their flight schedules make them, the largest foreign carrier in the U.S. They serve, a tremendous number of destinations. I didn't look up the number, but it's something like 60, somewhere 40 or 60 U.S. destinations. For whom, most of these destinations, most international trips are at least one stop anyway. So that one stop, might as well be Toronto or Vancouver. And so if an Air Canada is getting just a couple % of the U.S. transatlantic business, say today, and they could up that, say to 4% and double it, right? Or maybe it's 3% and 6%, it's small amount to doubled is a small amount, but meaningful. And the loyalty program could do that. That would actually be material for their business. So yeah, I think they could be rewarded.
Is there any quantification or sense to passengers book towards or away from trips that involve U.S. pre-clearance airports?
Oh, I don't know of actual data on this. Look, I know that I hate U.S. pre-clearance because I have global entry.
Yeah.
If I didn't have global entry, I would love it. But now that they have global entry at pre-clearance, it's not as bad. But the worst thing would be, clearing, in say Abu Dhabi, and you're supposed to, leave the lounge something like, you're supposed to be there 90 minutes before your flight. So and it's the other side of the airport. You have to leave the lounge 2 hours before your flight to go to pre-clearance, and then you sit around. Fortunately, there's at least a lounge, but it's always way overcrowded. And it's creepy as can be because there's cameras monitoring everyone, but also sound recording. They're monitoring all the conversations in the lounge too. It's just and there's nowhere to sit. It's I don't want to do that.
Last one, fun one. Starlux Airlines, 4 years of status, a whole ton of U.S. routes. Will I be able to fly them from Seattle to Taipei? And what's the outlook for the airline?
Right. So look, I think it's like this is non-crazy. I mean, so I mean the backstory and all this is what's crazy. Where you had the family members ousted from one Taiwanese airline, after the patriarch dies, go and like start another one. They've got plenty of money behind it. I think that they actually do need to really engage at a national level and a national strategy with the U.S. Because I think that frankly, from a Taiwanese national security standpoint, having spoken to some Taiwanese airline executives, they were actually very worried about this election. They viewed Donald Trump's anti-China stance as beneficial to them and a signal that the U.S. would support Taiwan. I actually think that Joe Biden's foreign policy will be, fairly conventional, and the, implied commitments in the Taiwan Relations Act will be more likely to be, upheld in a Biden administration, versus where maybe it's not entirely clear what the U.S. benefit is to, to going and helping like Taiwan. But they're, very, very much going to be as relations with China become really important. China cracks down in Hong Kong, sees Taiwan, and as President Xi looks to re-election in a couple of years, does he need to make a move towards? Is it too risky to make a move against Taiwan because he doesn't want to go badly, or does he feel like he needs to, make progress towards, reunifying this greater China that's been the broader project? And in order to forestall that, frankly, they need U.S. relations. So I think, more flights from Taiwan to the U.S., more exchange is going to be pretty important for that. And so just with that broad mental model, I think, I'd be betting on, more Taiwan flights, whether that is, China Airlines or whether it's Starlux. That doesn't necessarily imply, but look, Taiwan needs to deepen U.S. ties, really a lot quickly.
I didn't expect the answer to go that way. I'm so used to any discussions of Taiwanese airlines related to Hello Kitty planes and how to find them.
love the Hello Kitty, right? I think and love the service and the business class seat, and the meals are great. Fantastic as a connecting point to much of Asia when the schedules work. Availability can be decent. You use your United miles and whatever, right? But I'm just like, but you asked me, do I think we'll get to fly them, and will they have flights? I mean, how would I think about that? Well, I don't know the answer whether they'll do what they've said, but what would my framework be? This is how I would think about it.
Okay, so Bangalore, Seattle, that's going to happen. I'm going to be able to fly that.
American says so, right? I mean, United is front running them with their San Francisco flight, and the biggest market is San Francisco, Bangalore. Well, Americans like, yeah, but we're always talking about connections, right? Okay, well, you're taking all the San Francisco connections kind of out the window. Seattle is a good connecting point, but San Francisco is not bad either. We'll see if there's enough. I think they're going to compete in that, and it's part of their initial deal with Alaska. And Alaska can help them at least with the Seattle market, somewhat the San Francisco, but they'll probably lose to the nonstop. But the LA and up the rest of the West Coast, maybe people will fly San Jose, Seattle, Bangalore, rather than driving around the Bay Area. So, I think they're going to try it.
Okay, last one: editorial sensibility and your own sense of humor. How do you decide which of news of the weird, which of the stories of people doing crazy things in travel are you going to dedicate to a blog post, and which are you just going to link to in a roundup?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, if it strikes me as super funny, I'm more likely to write about it. If it also strikes me as something where there's some kind of a broader lesson in this, then I'm more likely to write about it. If it's just this thing happened, then it's like, okay, here, this thing happened. But if I really want to tell the story because it makes me laugh, and I enjoy it. This is the thing is, a lot of people don't happen to appreciate my sense of humor, and that's fine. I write what I find interesting and amusing, and if something's really funny to me, I'm going to write it. But also hopefully, if there's also a parable in it, a lesson of some kind about broader, social trends, or about travel, or who's traveling, what they're thinking. Then it's a post.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to eventual publication of a compendium of Gary's parables and miscellany. Thank you for joining us today, Gary.